Hello, everybody, and welcome to Session 3, Room 2, Common House Reservation Fees with Mike Mariano. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to learning. Mike is an architect with a passion for design and resilient communities. He founded Schemata Workshop in 2004 with architect partner and spouse Grace Kim, with a focus on empowering communities. He lives in Capitol Hill Urban Co-Housing in Seattle. Welcome, Mike. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. It's great to be here, everyone. Excellent. Okay, well, Rain's gave me a little bit of an overview, but yeah, Grace and I did found our office back in 2004 and learned about co-housing back in '92, from a Danish architect, actually, when we were studying in London. Had this in the back of our heads for some time and actually got a group together in 2010. So a decade ago this year, got the group together then and moved in 2016. So I've got about 24 slides just to go over today, and it's maybe 30, 35 minutes worth of material. If you want to save your questions till the end, it's a pretty broad approach to common areas and how they're used. So yeah, let me get started on this then. So we are located in Capitol Hill, kind of what our former president called the anarchist jurisdiction. So we're right in the heart of the Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. It's not as chaotic as everyone was kind of led to believe. Certainly we've all had our challenges with communities and neighborhoods this last year, but looking forward to moving ahead. My approach to this presentation is essentially to consider the common house to be all shared common areas in the building. Some communities that we've designed, others that I've visited, things are collected together into essentially a single common house, with all of those amenity spaces together. Our community that you see on the right-hand side of the screen here, we've actually kind of scattered those amenity areas and the common house is distributed throughout the building. We are on the smaller side of a co-housing community in that we're 9 homes, 17 adults, 11 kids, stretched across 9 different households. Go on. Yeah, so co-housing being founded under this principle of coming together in collaboration, it's clearly not necessarily an entirely selfless effort, but there's personal benefits in collaborating with community to live in community intentionally. So co-housing being a model founded in that collaboration, mutual support, and trust, it's the way it needs to happen. I think those of you that are in communities now certainly understand that there's no way that founders and burning souls on their own can do it entirely on their own. That doesn't build the community that we all aspire to live in. So it's that collective wisdom of the group that leads to the success. Our community uses consensus model for decision making, but being only 9 households, we operate similar to some of the sociocratic circles of decision making that operates that way. It's an advantage we have to being a little smaller on the community side. So the yellow in the diagram here is essentially our common areas kind of stretched out through the community. This is as if you kind of exploded our 5-story building apart. The yellow are what we consider the common areas of the building. So the common house kind of stretched throughout. It's convenient that when we're going through the photos that I'll share with you, that's that same yellow that connects us all together. So the yellow representing the common areas, all of the individual homes kind of pinwheeling off of that. Our homes are in an apartment building that we collectively all own together. So each of the homes are self-contained units, as all co-housing communities typically are. We have a common house kind of down at the lower level off of a central courtyard space. The homes tend to be, on the smaller side of things, 850 square feet to 1,300 square feet. So, that's certainly small compared to a lot of the single family detached homes that are out there. but it's not necessarily small given the urban context that we're in. The size of the units, was part of, an efficiency of, individuals and living, compact, lives in a great urban neighborhood. But because of that, we're all counting on using the common areas in the building, so the common house and all of the areas that are stretched throughout. So co-housing, being this model, of, coming from a feeling of generosity and abundance. This session was based on, fees and, resource usage and such. And, I want to make sure that I convey the importance of coming at it from this feeling of generosity and abundance, the same reasons that we all came together to create an intentional community together. There's a lot of different approaches to, how we share, life in the community, just like Michael was mentioning, he heard a session on common meals earlier, and, some communities charge, some don't. There's a myriad of options for how communities do that. Everyone here knows that, co-housing in North America tends to be predominantly white, upper middle income, higher educated individuals. We need to begin to open that up to others and, see a broader representation of people in our co-housing communities. So that's the hope. And I think the more that we can get away from, thinking about fees and charging for usage, and actually kind of sharing out of this generous nature and this abundant approach to what we have to share, is something that we really need to aspire to. So that's what I'm going to share today. So our common house, we've got a community that pre-pandemic, used to meet 3 times a week for meals, and it gets a lot of use for a lot of different events. The idea that it can be used for anything that a resident wants to use it for. Meals and community uses certainly take priority for the space, but it needs to be open for all people. So all residents have the ability to share the space. The image on the left is a resident that wanted to share a tamale making experience with the community. So this was open to everyone in the community, kind of friends and families of the households in the community. The image on the right was the Women's March, that occurred shortly after current president was elected. But just this ability to share these resources as a community without worry about how we charge fees for them, that this is truly an extension of our home. The entire building is our home. Funding of common house uses and such, thinking about how we do it in our community. We're a rental community where the building collectively owns everything, so we kind of have fixed fees that come off of, essentially out of our rent that we pay in. A lot of co-housing communities are condominium associations where HOA dues covers those sorts of things. What we found is that those fixed fees tend to have an impact on communities kind of equally, but not necessarily equitably. And clearly, people come at their lives from different economic perspectives and backgrounds. So the idea of getting into voluntary contributions of discretionary spending is what we found is useful, and I'll start to share some of the ways that we've done that here too. We have a guest room in our community. Many do. I've reached out to some other communities, just to listen to how they use their guest rooms, and oftentimes, it's an extension of the home. In our case, we were living compactly. People don't have extra guest rooms and things in their buildings. So the ability to make this available for anyone that a family might want to, offer to have this available for them. So, not necessarily limiting the quantity of days. I mean, clearly some families have more space than others. Some may have, a need more frequently than others for a myriad of reasons, but just being respectful and being generous with how we share this. Not necessarily wanting to put policies and guidance in place any more than we absolutely need to. Some communities I found, will limit the number of days and how far in advance, groups can, or a family can, reserve a guest room, but oftentimes it's pretty flexible. A lot of common areas in the building, just a quick list on the left, shop space, art room. I was talking with a group that had, a kiln that was shared within the community. I'm going to share more about our rooftop garden. Oftentimes there's both active and passive rooms in the community. Talking with one of the communities, that I spoke to, they made the point that if an activity enriches an individual's life within the community, that is worth supporting because it really extends out to everyone else that lives in the community as well. So the idea that, someone can show some initiative and take care of a shop space or use a kiln to create art, and that's a craft that they have a passion for. If the rest of us can support that with kind of a nominal investment on our part, then clearly it's going to enrich everyone else's lives as well. Sorry, my mouse is a little fussy here. So the idea of keeping those fixed costs down, clearly there's investment that needs to be made from a capital perspective in investing in those things like the shop space and the kiln, but ongoing stewardship and maintenance. The idea that an annual your HOA dues, an annual budget, fixed fees that might come out of your rent. Residents can be responsible for taking care of that guest room or that guest suite or that workshop. And actually being a steward of that space. Some co-housing communities might actually, pay to have someone take care of those things and do more cleaning and maintenance. Oftentimes, the beauty of living in an intentional community like co-housing is that you have the ability to share those responsibilities, across the board with everyone in your community. Those that are using it, can kind of show a passion for that and become stewards of the space. One of the things that we found is that, there's a number of events and activities that can take place in our common areas. So this might not be, your common house. This is an image off of our common house of our courtyard space. And in this case, we had a resident that knew a local singer-songwriter, who was doing a Kickstarter for a new album, for his band. And we have a budget for our community life team that's an annual thing, but this was kind of a one-off event. So in this case, the household or the resident that wanted to sponsor it kind of put it out there, would there be interest in having, a singer-songwriter in the courtyard? And, of course, there's some residents that bring up concerns about, how loud is it going to be? How many people are we going to charge, attendance and that sort of thing. But just kind of having the resident within the community kind of put it out there, get a feel for how things are going. And if there's general receptivity to it, then we can figure out ways to actually, fund it. So essentially a voluntary effort on the part of the community. There is a fixed cost, associated with this, but offering it to everyone. And essentially we found that anonymous contributions, which you could always dig into and figure out exactly who contributed what. Because in this case, there was one resident that was kind of collecting the funds that were going to pay for the singer-songwriter to come in. But the idea to contribute anonymously, and there's no pressure, there's no obligation. But once that's funded, then all the residents, all the households can experience the common area in a new way. And this is a case where it's kind of expanded to more opportunities that we're pursuing of similar events and such. So other community events. So, within the common house, off of the common house, there's a number of community life events that we have kind of on an annual budget that the group has budgeted for. Again, there's one-off things that come up. But we have prioritized, a series of events throughout the year, and the community life team actually proposes a budget, and we talk about that as a community and figure out, what is it that's a reasonable, budget that we might have for that group. And then, we've gone ahead and just said, anonymously, above and beyond kind of, the basic contributions that you're making to the community, you could contribute, discretionary spending, discretionary funds to support more of these community events and things. So we've opened it up in that way, such that, not everyone's obligated to, and those that have the ability to can contribute, but those that don't, still get to enjoy events as they might occur. The rooftop farm, essentially, an expansion of our common area. This is the view of the upper rooftop. The idea that it enriches our life, just like, events in the common areas, that singer-songwriter, musician, the rooftop farm represents, a hobby for some people. It represents sustenance for others. Passive opportunity to go up and enjoy the skyline views and sunsets. We found it's just been incredibly exciting to have it up there. We had a vision at the outset of our community that we wanted children to know what fresh produce tasted like. The idea of, picking, fresh berries and carrots out of the garden, and that, spinach doesn't come from a frozen block that you might find in the grocery store, that that you can actually grow and sustain your community in that way. So it's been a spectacular use of the common area, up on the rooftop. The funding of that, certainly came at some expense. So, we did have to figure out a way to pay for these things. We had a very tight budget for the construction of our building, and it's the same thing that we're all dealing with. We looked at a number of different ways to do that, to bring money into the community. And one of these, was this rooftop farm, and we did what's called a barn raiser, because it's oftentimes a fundraiser organization that helps, farming and garden groups kind of get money. So we kind of put this together, and we found a partner in a farm to table restaurant nearby that we could, they could take a couple of the beds and invest in kind of the cost of getting things going, and they could come up and harvest some of the food for their own use in the evening. And then we had other beds that were reserved for the community. We funded some of this through, sunset dinner, that was open to a number of people that contributed, funds to, help support the garden. But we had this same restaurant owner, the chef, come up and do a dinner for people in the community. So this was an opportunity for, the neighborhood to support this garden up on this rooftop, in our building. We did custom printed canvas bags, and we actually provided and delivered, produce from our garden to some people that provided kind of a modest investment into it. We also had a local community college that was interested in using it as a learning opportunity for their students. They had a little kind of urban agriculture program and greenhouse, within their community, but the idea that they could come over here and kind of learn from growing produce on the rooftop. Stewardship and maintenance, and we have a garden team that's assigned to do this. We have a budget, that they come to the greater community with on an annual basis, and we talk about that and, figure out what's a reasonable allocation. The farm to table restaurant nearby, we asked for an annual commitment from them to actually help sustain this common area usage of the farm. And it's been great in the sense that they help to pay for some of, the water fees and, some of the other ongoing maintenance. I mentioned Seattle Urban Farm Company here because they were a partner with us as we were getting the farm going up on the rooftop. And the restaurant, in this case, kind of paid them to harvest and keep planting things for them. I want to share a quick 2-minute video of the rooftop farm. So I'm past co-chair of an organization called the Capitol Hill Eco District, which is looking at sustainability at the scale of the neighborhood. So, we have our 9 homes within our co-housing community located on Capitol Hill in this greater neighborhood of 26,000 residents. It's a neighborhood that's the size of some small towns. In this case, they put out a request for, how are we using areas within our communities to support a sense of social cohesion within our neighborhood, as well as how are we kind of sustaining our community. There was a stormwater aspect too. So Grace and my 12-year-old daughter helped put together this short 2-minute video. So let me go ahead and turn this on. Ooh. Sorry.
Should we be hearing audio here? Mike, there's no audio. I think you need to stop sharing and reshare with the audio box checked.
Oh, okay. Stop sharing.
There's a little box at the bottom when you choose to share computer audio, at least if it's on a Mac.
Okay, yeah. Let's see. And we're standing in the heart of the Capitol Hill. Hi, my name is Mike Mariano. I'm an architect in Schemata.
It's a little faint.
And we're standing in the heart of the Capitol Hill district.
And I'm Grace Kim. I'm also with Schemata Workshop, and we're standing here in front of our office. We live upstairs, and we'd like to take you on a tour of our rooftop farm.
Thanks for letting me quickly share that. Can you guys hear me okay now?
Yep.
My
Hear it loud and clear.
So that 2-minute video actually captures a lot of our common area open space, again, as an expansion of a very limited common house that we have within our community. But that garden area and both of these upper rooftops, of the garden farm as well as the PV array kind of allow us to take advantage of essentially every square foot of space on the building. So I'm showing the PV array, the photovoltaic array, because it's a common area that we had actually, some in the community had anticipated putting in a greenhouse and possibly a sauna. So the idea that our common areas would start to support more, use like that. However, we didn't have volunteers stepping up to fund a sauna or a greenhouse on the roof, but we did have a family in the community that wanted to essentially invest in a PV array, for the building. And, generate power off of the rooftop. It was something that we'd hoped we could do early on during construction, and the cost, was just too high. But in this case, it's a family that came to the community and said, we'd like to fund this, just out of our own pockets. We'd like to contribute this to the community, and the community would benefit from, feeding power back to the grid. The community had to have a conversation about all of our common areas and, think about, is it okay to do this in lieu of, the sauna or the greenhouse or something else that might have gone up here. But everyone, after a lot of discussion and debate, realized that this was a good investment. We recognized the families contributing the funding, the household contributing the funding to make this happen. It was just an appreciated gesture on their part. The community had to kind of obligate themselves to, maintenance in the future, but it should be pretty nominal. We had, because it's part of our common area in the building, we had a careful review of that system to make sure that, it was made in a way that we as a community could still maintain the roof under it and everything, but came to some agreements there and eventually got it installed this summer. All of this, so the areas that I shared with you, a tremendous amount of space that's leveraged for community use within the building. And I want to make sure that, again, we approach, you all approach, your communities from this perspective of generosity and abundance in sharing everything that we all have. So the idea that, individuals will kind of be able to share at different times in their lives, the idea that we're building social capital up within these intentional communities where we all know our neighbors, and everything's not perfect, it's not utopia, but the idea that we can share together when it's available. As I was thinking through kind of this idea of fees and things, I really wanted to kind of come at it from that perspective. So in talking with communities that I did, a lot of the ones I talked to just really felt like common areas are an extension of their home, and there's no need to charge reservations or fees. But there's obviously a need to find a way to fund kind of the ongoing maintenance and operations and things. And that's what I wanted to share today, were some of the different ways that we've done that through, asking for volunteers to step up. And if they don't step up, then, some things don't happen, and that's perfectly fine. But then leveraging other opportunities within your communities and your neighborhoods, like in this case, kind of a nicer farm to table restaurant that wanted to support the rooftop garden, or, these one-time events that occur periodically, like the singer-songwriter in the courtyard, and just kind of putting it out there for the families to do. There's obviously conversation about, it's something that not all families can contribute to. So, how does that make everyone feel? And, is there any obligation or not? And making sure that everyone understands that, it's a perspective of generosity, that it's being put out there as a chance to share, in the case of the musician, some live music in the courtyard. We and a lot of other communities just use a shared Google Calendar to book the guest room and see when common meals are being served in the common house, that sort of thing. We use a private Facebook group. Facebook, for all its challenges and tribulations, is actually perfect for a private group because it allows us to share information pretty quickly. There was a session earlier this morning on Mosaic, which is an app by a co-housing resident. I know that's gotten a good following too. And then there's kind of old school ways of sharing kind of information and events around the building, which might just be a central bulletin board and whiteboard. Again, not getting into the technological side of how these things happen, but just making sure that you come at it from a perspective of generosity. So that is what I had for today. And again, I know that's a broad definition of common house and common areas, but that's kind of what I wanted to share. So I'm happy to take some questions and let's have a conversation. I'd love to hear about some of what you're doing in your communities. Those of you that are already formed and in community, and maybe hear from others that have aspirations for what they'd like their communities to be.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to stop your share there so we can see each other. see all the wonderful faces in the room, and I'll call on folks both by Zoom raising hand and physically raising hand. But first, I had a clarification, a couple of things from your talk. Did I hear correctly that for events you host in the community, there's always some member that's responsible? That's the ultimate authority?
That is correct, yeah. And I did talk to some communities. I mean, they're really, some welcome outside involvement and participation in renting out their common house, for major events and things. But a lot of the communities I talked to said that really it's first and foremost for the residents and the households of that co-housing community. And yeah, that they really kind of frowned upon something that wasn't connected to a resident in the community. And that's the way that we approach it in ours as well. As long as it's sponsored by someone in the community, there can be, scout meetings or, March kind of pre-function activities and that sort of thing. But the focus is on all of those that live in that specific co-housing community.
I really appreciated the key point you made early on, that it's about, if you have happy residents that can do the things they want, it makes it possible if they're bringing things that clearly enrich other members' lives. And that's a very different perspective than some communities. It's easy to get stuck in. It's all about control and access and a value of fairness over ease of doing things. Is that a balance you've had to work on?
It is, and you mentioned it perfectly there, Rains, but that idea of control and the idea of charging and limiting people's use of a space is absolutely something we need to move on from. That's just, it's not a place that we can be coming from. We've all embarked on this effort to build co-housing and live in an intentional community, and we absolutely have to share what it is that we've created together. And if you start charging and you start limiting the usage, then you start to confine that control to a limited number of people, and we don't feel like that's the right approach. So again, the idea of coming at it from a perspective of generosity and sharing what it is that we've created together.
Excellent. And heading up to the roof, somebody had asked about how much electricity you generate from the solar, and then we've got some farm-related questions.
7 kilowatts.
So it's a partial offset of your common use, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a partial offset of our common areas. We're fortunate to be in the Pacific Northwest, where most of our power is actually pretty clean. It comes from hydro. We have some of the cheapest electricity in the world, unfortunately, because it doesn't incentivize that sort of thing. The payback on a PV array like that is 10 to 12 years or something. There's little incentive because our hydro is so cheap. In this case, we actually did a lot with our building from a passive standpoint, so our energy load was actually quite low in the first place. And those are investments that we wanted to make early on. Couldn't do everything we wanted to, but this one family, this one household that just had this idea in mind, there was always envisioned a PV array on the upper rooftop, and they said, we've always wanted to do this, and when we had the means, we wanted to contribute it. And at the end of last year, they came to all of us and said that now's the time.
Excellent. I had a similar experience back at Swan's Market Co-housing, where I used to live, and at the time got a system financed by the electricity it generated, but which is more common these days. So yeah, somebody else was asking about how does your produce get used. I remember back and I'll get the question in a second, but I just remember your fundraiser campaign back when you were developing. And at the time I thought, oh, that's odd. Isn't this really for the residents? Shouldn't they be paying for this? And I sort of get it now. It's about the greater community and the values alignment kind of, you talked about eco district, but it seems like an eco village kind of principle of putting these pieces together.
Yeah, everything is we're trying to leverage as much of this little building, this 1/10 of an acre that we're on. We're trying to do as much as we can for, not only our community within these walls, but the greater neighborhood too. So the idea of kind of, using this as a demonstration project, granted, we did have some deep conversations as a community about this farm to table restaurant that a lot of residents in the community will never eat at. It's too expensive. It's just, that's it. But they could commit to managing 2 of those beds up on the upper rooftop when we as a community couldn't take that all on because the amount of time that went into that was significant. When the pandemic hit earlier this spring, we said no outsiders in the building, only those that live in the building. So, the restaurant that we had an agreement to, we just said, not this year, which meant that we took it all over. And the video that I showed was actually from July, and that was our garden team taking that on and just doing a fabulous job with it. It's not something I put time into, but I so appreciate having it available. And the food and the produce and the berries, and just spectacular. It's an amazing resource for us to have.
So yeah, Pat from Ravens Crossing was asking, how does the produce get used? It was aside from the restaurant requirements, individually or for shared meals?
The priority is for shared meals. 2 of the beds are divided up into small little pea patches that each of the individual households on an annual basis can make a request for. So it's 4 feet wide by 6 feet long or something, enough to grow a bunch of things. And then the other beds are all shared. There's tomatoes and things growing on the vines. We have a berry patch in one of the beds. So the berries are shared by everyone in the community. What we find is even within the 27 people that live in our community, it's way more than we can consume. And I was picking raspberries and tomatoes and strawberries and sharing them with our neighbors, as well as basil. The amount of pesto I was generating recently was just unbelievable. And I love being able to share that. In some cases, as a community, not everyone has the time to do that, but I've got a food processor. I'll go out and get, I'll do a non-dairy kind of no nut version, and then I'll do other versions. But the ability to go up and harvest a whole bunch of this basil and make something and then share it with the community, and I'll just kind of package it up and deliver it to people at their doors if they like it. It's been fun.
Nice. That really does seem to be living the value you expressed earlier of taking care of each other. I'll open it up for people who can raise a hand with questions, or another example perhaps about, again, any aspect of common houses or other common spaces, fees or systems, challenges, maybe some challenge people run into. Yours?
Getting creative. Creativity is the key. Unfortunately, everything takes money.
I do recall when I stayed there before the conference a year ago, the guest room was creatively created. It didn't feel like it was a fully enclosed room, but a curtain or some other ways made it private enough. But it feels like sometimes people, worry about, if we put down an actual room, then we'll be a regulated hotel or Airbnb or something.
Yeah, and the guest room, I think I mentioned this in the slides, but a lot of communities will have kind of a list of things that they may wish to buy, kind of a wish list of things that for their common house or their guest room. Most communities don't like to collect money, but some guests, will want to kind of share something back. And we always say, we don't want the money, we don't want to track it, but here's a list, and if you want to buy a cheese grater for the common house, or a pressure cooker or something, go for it. These
so it's like a registry for a wedding or something.
Yeah, kind of like that. Yeah. In our case too, our common house, we've got 900 square feet of space. It's pretty small. So our guest room was also a little sitting room that could be closed off and, with its own bathroom off of it. But it's an okay guest room, but it's not as nice as what you might see in some communities.
But it is multifunctional, as many communities do. Every space has many uses.
Mm-hmm. And anyone in co-housing, in the co-housing world, we always make it available.
It's always appreciated. What else are people doing out there in terms of shared spaces, systems to fairly allocate them? Money is just one tool. Anything people have been doing and stopped doing or evolved over time? Gail? And just remember to unmute.
I just wonder, I raised my kids in Enumclaw. I'm a little familiar with, I'm in Utah now, with Seattle. What do you guys do for parking?
We are honestly in a very urban neighborhood that is right near the light rail train. Pre-pandemic, got a fair amount of use. Probably half of our 9 households have cars. The others don't. We've had some good car sharing programs in the community up here. We had looked at putting a parking garage underneath the building. Certainly could have done it. I was the architect. I always thought if someone really wanted a bedroom for their car, we could make a whole lower level with an elevator lift that would take your car down, and you could park your cars down there. But the cost of doing that would have elevated up the buy-in for everyone else. At the onset, when we formed about 10 years ago, we had quite a bit of socioeconomic diversity in the community. We had some that just never wanted to be homeowners and needed something that was kind of more modest, and then others that wanted something longer term and a little bigger, and trying to come up with an approach that could satisfy everyone. And parking on site was just one of those things that fell to the wayside. So those that have cars pay for a parking garage nearby. You might pay a couple $100 a month to park a car. Obviously, if you're paying that, it makes you question, do I really need the car or not? And everything's very walkable in the neighborhood. So yeah, that's parking.
Thank you. I do recall, yeah, there's a little driveway out back for loading.
Yep.
But yeah, in urban spots and some of the modern communities, if I recall, Daybreak and PDX Commons in Portland, in general, the banks are the main drivers of requirements for parking in cities, of course, before that, but more and more they're moving in the direction where they can of saying, hey, we actually want to encourage less cars and make parking optional. We're Eastern Village in Silver Spring, Maryland, they don't have their own parking and people can lease spaces in the city lot next door.
Yep, that's right.
Maggie. And then Jan, I haven't missed your second question. We'll come back to that.
The reason some of us are not speaking is because we're not together yet and we're just learning in this session today. And so I'm really hoping that anyone who's in a form community would pipe in. It would help us.
Thank you. I do see a question, follow-up question from Jan at Hartwood Commons in Tulsa. Did you say you can go on the shared calendar and reserve the guest room without limits on the number of days? I know some communities ration those or allocate them.
And that's my understanding too, is that some communities do ration them. We haven't gotten to that point. Community event needs to take priority over, other usage. So we make sure that that shared Google Calendar that everyone has access to is kept current. We haven't had a need to ration, but I do understand some other communities have done that.
Especially if you're in a tourist destination, and sure you can raise the price, but then you want them to keep it reasonable. At Berkeley Co-Housing, we set it to just a few dollars for relatives and a higher fee for non-related people, which are mostly visiting co-housers and some with other connections. And I know as the most often person who's hosting other people, even though I might reserve something on the calendar, I'll be in discussions with other communities. And if a neighbor really needs a place for a relative, I'll say, oh, can I place the visiting co-houser elsewhere in another nearby community so to keep the room free? And so to try to be elegant and using a last minute opportunity, but moving out of the way to give priority to people with connections. We've actually, of course, like many communities, or most, I think, stopped hosting guests at times of COVID, especially because people are now using the common house as co-working spaces, and we'll be sharing the restroom there. But we're now looking at, there's one unit that's actually connected to right behind the guest room as part of the common house. And so a family member there coming, it seems like, oh, that's a little bit different because they can come and go through the other unit and not be in the common house. So we're working on a proposal now to try to open up in that little way and try it out. Other related questions or insights from people with the experience of living in community?
If there is a way that a community can support those guest rooms by not charging, again, recognizing that some individuals in the community and their families simply, that may be a hurdle and a burden for them. So if the rest of you can figure out a way to support it via, whatever your fees or your HOA dues, just to make that available for that usage, it is really important.
And we're actually looking at, Wild Sage Co-House in Boulder, Colorado. I was the first place I saw, and I've seen it elsewhere. There's a higher fee for cleaning of the guest room, so you could do it all yourself, and the resident is ultimately responsible. But the guests could be just pay a fee, which then can pay another member to do it, and it'd be supplementary income. And so I like looking for that kind of win-win solution. What else is out there? We were at 15 minutes to go. other related topics or things that Mike didn't address as much that have come up in either people planning community or living in community?
One question I have is, Mike, you're talking about the garden and working up a partnership with someone to help fund that space. Have you heard or seen a program like that for other spaces like wood shops or anything like that to help fund those spaces?
Not yet. In talking with some other communities, I mean, there are some communities that you might live in, they have fabulous shop spaces. And then others that I visited, that are just dumping grounds for everyone's old tools and things. So you really do need someone that's kind of a shop steward in the community who takes pride in that. And, the people that I've talked to that are good, woodworkers and craftspeople, really have a passion for that sort of thing. So again, they get something out of it by maintaining a shop space that's safe and clean for other people to use. And that's part of their coming at it from a generous perspective and willing to share kind of that passion that they have with the greater community. So I do see that happening, but not at the level of partnership, that you're mentioning, kind of with the greater neighborhood. I would have loved to have had a bike and a wood shop in our community. That was one of the things I really wanted. And yet it just kind of fell to the wayside of just trying to squeeze as much onto the site as we could.
You do have a little bit of a shop area, if I recall, by the bike rack. There's a very nice bike racks there.
It's okay. It's not much of a shop, but it's okay. Yeah, I mean, if there was another co-housing community nearby or someone that wanted to share something like that, maybe to your point, Ryan, there'd be a chance to kind of share the costs associated with it. I mean, there have been some maker spaces here on Capitol Hill, where you can rent kind of a laser cutter and, other equipment and CNC machines and all these things that you might not otherwise buy. Unfortunately, the pandemic's taken a toll on those too.
Definitely. And there's also all of these things bring up questions of insurance, liability, and yeah, are the lenders and HUD going to make it easy to get mortgages on a property, most often, condos, if you've got other sources of income or other functions that are not purely residential. So if you keep it at all, this is just clubhouse, and this is all space run by the residents for the residents. The key is presenting in a way that fully reflects accurately the use, but make sure you're not raising flags or triggers, especially if you're talking to banks or insurers or regulators. Learn from examples of how people present things appropriately and legally to get in there. Anyway, I see some following up. Pat from Ravens Crossing asking about how you deal with common laundry expenses.
We have a common laundry area. We provided hookups in all of the units for washers and dryers, but when we moved in 4 years ago, not everyone did that. We had a single washer and dryer in the common house that would be used for linens and things like that. And then those families actually paid a slightly higher monthly rent to cover the cost of the washer and dryer. When the pandemic hit, however, we realized that it wasn't probably, and no one really knew, but it didn't seem to be a good idea to be sharing laundry together and moving through that interior space together. So the community actually used some funds that we had set aside and went ahead and provided washers and dryers to the families that didn't have them in their units. So that kept everyone out of the common areas. We have central hot water in the building, so a central domestic hot water system in the building that's a fairly efficient system. Otherwise, everyone's paying for, their own electricity within their own home. I've seen a whole bunch of systems in different places around the world, different co-housing communities, throughout Europe and North America. And, sometimes you pay per use, sometimes it's voluntary, sometimes it's just included in all the other fees. Lots of different ways of doing that.
But we have a finance committee that loves to figure out, okay, this is the full depreciation cost of the washers and their expected life. So therefore, let's contribute each this much, and they'll pay part of the common house electric and so forth. But yeah, you can either spend a lot of time tracking nickels or make it easy. I've had also people come and say, oh, we can make the system so easy with RFID cards to track who's using the washer. And I have to explain, we use this system called a pencil and a piece of paper where you make a mark. Yes, we try to keep things simple. We're down to 10 minutes or less. Jan was asking, do you have a common house or space team? How many are on it? What are their responsibilities?
I have come across some co-housing communities that have, a specific common house team. In our case, we don't. We put the onus on whoever's doing the meal that night, to go ahead and kind of prep and clean. And we as a community came up with an agreed upon reset of the common house, all of the common areas, whenever they're used. When you're done, they go back to, all the furniture's put back, everything's spotless, cleaned up, as you would like to find it when, you go there to cook a meal for the entire community. So we did not find that we needed a common house or space team, and we had enough other teams dealing with community life and, a food team, a kitchen team, kind of things that kind of provided that overlap and covered all of that.
And Maggie says, please tell us about your community life team.
It's a fun team from what I can tell. I haven't been on that one yet, but they look at ways that we can enrich all of our lives together. So what kind of events might take place? You saw some slides from the Day of the Dead celebration that we had last week. That was a case where there was one family that was just, it was what they celebrated together, and Halloween and then Day of the Dead. And I'd never done that, but it was a chance for that family to share that part of their culture with everyone in the community. So, the community life team looks at how do we bring those things into the community, and within a modest budget, what can we allocate for some of those events to provide for, we went out and got a new wireless speaker recently so we could play some music, and, we bought some new lights, and just kind of, limited amount of budget. They made some cookies for everyone and baked a bunch of bread, and kind of this $50 budget, per event kind of thing. And then the community life team will help organize that. We found that the community life team wants to be efficient with their time, and they don't necessarily want all the burden to fall on them to do all these things. So what they've been really good about is putting together a list of things that need to go on. And between Halloween and the Day of the Dead, they said, here's a bunch of activities that we think would be kind of fun to do. If people sign up for them, then we'll go ahead and do them. If people don't sign up for them, then it's not important to the community. So that's kind of what the community life team does, is just help facilitate those opportunities to come together. So pre-pandemic, we would have summer solstice and winter solstice kind of progressive parties through the building, kind of rotating through, and they would organize that where we'd all visit each person's home for a meal or a course or a drink, and kind of move through all of the homes. And that was kind of fun. There's a spring Easter egg hunt, that kind of thing. So some things that are kind of secular and some that aren't.
A few of our traditions like that live on. And also I'll just note that the prior session in this room was on the related topics. And so as people go back to the recordings afterwards, you may want to look that up for another community life experience. So does anybody have any sort of different experience, or anything that would provide people with a different kind of example of what Mike shares? I really appreciate his model, but people could learn a bunch from hearing about if there's something that hasn't worked as well or works very differently. Anyone out there? Is it different in Alaska, Heather? Just create the space, or any other general question.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously all just my perspective. I visited a lot of communities. This seemed like a chance to share a personal perspective on a lot of these common areas. So that's what I've done. But I'd love to hear from those of you that are living in communities, though.
We are approaching the end of the day, and I think we've got a lot of folks that are looking here. And I'll note from my experience living in 2 different communities and in visiting 120 that there are systems will take on the character of the founders and of the priorities of the community and its location. But the happiest communities I've seen are ones that make space and don't feel like everybody has to be part of everything, that are just happy with enough delegation and confidence that people can become aware of and manage impacts, and not have feel like they have to weigh in and everybody come up with all the rules and put everything, you know, precisely into one place. But to make room to deal with people as they are and all their gifts, and as you were inspired what you had to share, Mike, about creating room for that opportunity.
You know, for those informing communities, don't overcomplicate things. I mean, as an intentional community, you're already taking on so much. And that's what we found when we moved in. For anyone that heard Sheila and Spencer talk this morning about the Common Meal Program, it's like the last thing we wanted to do was be tracking more money associated with meals. So we came up with the simplest program we could around that. And we have 100% participation. So you know, do what you can, keep it simple, but, you know, be respectful of that people are coming from all different perspectives in their lives, and that you as a community need to be supportive of wherever they're at.
Thank you, Mike. I think with that, let's say this will close the topic.
Thank you, everyone. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.